Good morning. We're going to get started. And I'd like to begin this morning by welcoming our newest board member, Felipe Franco, who's joining us for the first time today. Felipe is the Senior Fellow for Young Adult Practice at the Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, where he focuses on identifying and supporting best practices to support system-involved young adults in their transition to adulthood. Felipe's career demonstrates a deep commitment to promoting and providing services to transform the lives of young people involved in the justice system. Previously, he served as the Deputy Commissioner of the Division of Youth and Family Justice at ACS, and before that, he was the Deputy Commissioner of the Division of Juvenile Justice and Opportunities for Youth at the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, where he oversaw the full continuum of juvenile justice services. Welcome, Felipe. And this morning, I'd like to welcome all of you to the first public hearing on the board's proposed rulemaking on restrictive housing. The second public hearing will also be held in this auditorium at 125 Worth Street on December 16th, 2019. It will start at 5 p.m. to accommodate a public request that we schedule a second hearing after work hours. We hope this will encourage correction officers, other people who work in the jails, and the public to have their voices heard at the hearing. The proposed rules, which were publicly posted on October 29, 2019, are designed to ensure that people in the department's custody are placed in restrictive housing in accordance with due process and procedural justice principles, and are confined in the least restrictive setting and for the least amount of time necessary to address the specific reasons for their placement and to ensure their own safety as well as the safety of staff and other people in custody. To encourage input from people in custody, correction officers, and other facility staff, the board worked with the department to post flyers in the jails announcing the proposed rules and explaining how to obtain a copy and submit comments. The department posted flyers in each jail staff locker room, law library, visit area, and clinic. The department is keeping a copy of the proposed rule and retains the rule package, which includes the statement of basis and purpose, in each facility's law library and Office of the Deputy Warden of Administration. The board thanks the department for its assistance in this important outreach effort. Additionally, if people in custody, correction officers, or other jail staff calls the board and requests a copy of the proposed rule package, we will mail them a copy. We also have created a voicemail box so that anyone, including people in custody and people who work in the jails, can call and leave a comment via voicemail. The board recognizes the importance of capturing the voices of people in custody and uniformed staff about what it's like to reside in restrictive housing and what it's like to work there. Thus, at the request of the board's ad hoc rulemaking committee, board staff spoke with correction officers and people in custody in various restrictive housing units as part of the fact-finding and rules development process. The board is grateful to the correction officers and people in custody who shared their experiences with board staff, as well as board staff's dedicated work in this regard. The board also encourages jail staff and people in custody to make their views known during the CAPA process. The board will review all comments, including comments submitted anonymously via phone or in writing. Today, and on December 16th, we will hear testimony from the public, and we will continue to welcome written testimony via mail, email, fax, or posting to the city's rulemaking webpage through January 3rd, 2020. The board will carefully consider all comments made at the hearings and submitted in writing and determine whether revisions should be made to the proposed rules. The board will submit final rules for certification by the law department in time for a final board vote at a future public meeting. Under CAPA, any rules adopted by the board will take effect 30 days after the board vote. We will now invite testimony from the public on the proposed rules. Speakers will be limited to 4 minutes. The iPad on the stage will tell you how much time you have left. I'm going to call up 3 speakers at a time. While the first speaker is providing testimony, the other 2 people can sit in the front row. And now I'll call the first 3 people. Alex Abel, Francis Gatellis, and Danielle Gerard. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. My name is Alex Abel. I'm with the Mental Health Project of the Urban Justice Center, and I'm also a member of the Jails Action Coalition. So I wanted to speak today specifically about the housing rules as they pertain to restrictive housing that doesn't seem to fall exactly under the traditional idea of restrictive housing. I'm speaking specifically about housing areas at NYC and about in 9 South in MDC. These are housing areas that, from my take on the proposed rules, aren't really excluded from or they don't fall under the mandate of the restrictive housing rules, and yet they are extremely restrictive housing areas. I think a lot of you have been there before, but I know that at NIC in particular, it's like, you know, people in the individual cells, the lockout time is in one or two people at a time in like a smaller caged area. There's very little light. It's like, I was there once. It's a horrible place to be. And I don't think that these restrictive housing rules actually address those housing rules. And so I'm really concerned that what's going to happen is basically a situation what happened with West Facility a few years ago, where the department just kind of shifted the goalposts a little bit and kept going and kept people in restrictive housing, even though it wasn't technically restrictive housing because it didn't fall into some of those rules. And so I'm really concerned about that, and I wanted to speak more generally about what that says about the department's culture and about what your role as a board, as an oversight board is. And I think that in general, within the department, you know, at every level, every rank, the idea is that punishment is the only way to deter, to stop violence. And I think that obviously that misses the bigger picture, but I do understand it to some extent. I work in the jails a couple days a week. I speak to officers. I listen to their conversations. I know that they're traumatized. People see violence every day. They're traumatized, and it's scary. It's scary to be out there. Sometimes I myself, you know, I meet with people one-on-one. Sometimes I feel a little bit of relief myself, for example, when I'm meeting with someone not in an open setting, but I bring my prejudice to that space, and I am relieved sometimes when there's like plexiglass between us, for example, on those rare occasions. But I think that is why your job is so important, is because these human reactions that officers and the people have in the jail to blame violence on individuals and not see the larger picture, that's why your job is so important. That's why you have to be the leaders in seeing that when we have an epidemic of violence, you don't treat an epidemic by treating the individual. You treat the environment. You treat the entire system that's at play. And that is why your role in this rulemaking is so important, and that's why the conversation, this is a very important conversation, obviously, getting human beings to be treated as human beings. That's so important. But I wish that we were talking more about what is being done to prevent the violence and why there isn't being more done to build up a community inside the jail, because it is a community where people are accountable for each other and where the response to violence is not more violence. And violence is not prevented by dehumanizing people, by being violent to them. I think that your role is, like, for example, I go into a lot of housing. There's more programming now than there ever has. I've been there for 5 years. I've been working there for 5 years. There's more programming now than there's ever been. And yet I go into so many housing areas and people are just sitting around just depressed. And there's like some job training, there's things to do, but there's not that kind of, that work that's being done to create a fabric of a community inside there that would actually prevent the violence in the first place. And so I think that's your job, is to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just as a point of clarification, the subchapter on structurally restrictive housing in the proposed rules is intended to cover the housing areas referenced in the testimony. Thank you. Francis Gatellis. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm also part of the Halt Solitary campaign with CAPA. I'm only tangentially going to address these new regulations. I think what we are asking for is that you do away with solitary confinement completely. And because you know that it is torture, and because you know that it makes people worse, it increases violence, it doesn't decrease violence. Now, in that context, though, I have to say that when I come to these meetings, I always get very disturbed, because you have rules, and some of the rules are decent in some ways, and yet the people from the jails come to you and say, we need your permission to break the rules. So last time I was here, you had a rule which says somebody is kept in solitary for 30 days and then has to be released for 7 days. And they asked for a waiver of that rule. So you all agreed to it. What does that mean? It means that solitary can go on indefinitely, that there is no limit, and that, in fact, you are agreeing to allow them to torture people. Now, the question then in my mind is, what are you really here for? If you didn't grant the waiver, and they said, well, we're going to go ahead with what we want to do anyway, what happens? I don't think anything is happening. You are just letting the prisons continue to torture people, and there's no action on your behalf. So what you're doing doesn't make much sense to me. And I think if you're going to make these new rules, you have to have a commitment to enforce the rules. Otherwise, you might as well just resign your positions and go home, because you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing as an oversight board. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gatellis. Danielle Gerard. Good morning.
Good morning. Interim Chair Sherman and board members, I'm Danielle Gerard, a staff attorney at Children's Rights. Thank you for the opportunity to comment publicly on the proposed rules. In 2014, the board approved standards that required the DOC to house young adults separately and apart from adults and provide them with age-appropriate programming. Since then, the department has repeatedly requested and the board has granted variances from those minimum standards. 5 years on, the board's proposed rules eliminate those requirements altogether and codify additional practices widely acknowledged to be harmful to young adults. Social science and neurological research that guide best practices for working with older youth show that their development does not end at age 18. Young people continue to mature well into their mid-20s, making them uniquely vulnerable and impressionable. This is especially true for young adults in child welfare and criminal justice systems. These young people require supports that respond to these needs. The proposed rules do not require the department to provide these supports. Children's Rights urges the board to amend the proposed rules to mandate that the department meet and strengthen its obligations to incarcerated young adults. The proposed rules should require that the department house young adults aged 18 to 21 separately and provide access to programming and services for all young adults. There is no evidence that reductions in violence are caused by the practice of commingling. Instead, research shows that there are more effective long-term methods to reduce violence, including more age-appropriate programming, more services, and continued better training for officers. We also know from experience that placing young adults in commingled housing units effectively cuts off their regular access to key programs and services. For example, only the young adults housed at RNDC can use the Peace Center. We urge the board to shift the department's emphasis regarding young adult housing areas from being for compliant youth to supportive, age-appropriate settings that can respond properly and effectively to predictable conflict and violence among young people who are being detained. During this critical period of development, the opportunity to interact with supportive adults and practice reasoning, decision-making, and self-regulating skills strengthens young people's ability to function in the years ahead. Youth have better outcomes if their unique needs are addressed. We urge the board to shift to the department's emphasis regarding programming. We believe programming should be made available for all incarcerated youth and should not be used as a reward system. Young adults should have 14 hours of lockout time, not 10. 10 hours is not enough for adults and is certainly not enough for young adults. Excessive isolation is incompatible with current research and policy for older youth. The proposed rules should require the department to abolish, first, the use of restraint desks. There is no reason to wait more than 2 years to end this cruel and inhumane practice. Second, solitary confinement. This is torture. In conclusion, children's rights would like to say that the proposed rules violate the board's stated recognition that young adults have unique needs and require a distinct management approach. The proposed rules as currently drafted codify variances that children's rights has repeatedly advocated against. Despite the repeated granting of these variances, however, the department's management of the jails has not improved. The Nunez Monitor's recent report shows that the use of force rate is the highest since the settlement agreement went into effect, especially for incarcerated youth. The proposed rules do not show that either the board or the department has a plan for allocating resources for management, officers, training, programming, and schools for this vulnerable population. We call on the Board of Correction to make amendments to the proposed rules to renew the department's commitment to the young adult plan. Young people incarcerated in our jails deserve no less.
Thank you.
Do you have any idea why you think the department changed its position on young adult housing from the way I understood it to be initially? No. Okay, thank you.
So I'll now call the next three speakers: Chaplain Kim Eliano, Rabbi Barat Elman, and Trent Taylor.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Once again, my name is Chaplain Kim Eliano. I am a CAPE supporter. I'm a humanitarian. And I'm a fierce faith leader for the injustices that plague humanity in this country.
Would you please repeat, you said that you are a...
My name is Chaplain Kim Eliano. I am a member of the CAPE campaign. I'm a humanitarian, and I'm a fierce faith leader who stands strongly and fights against the injustices that plague humanity here in this country. Amen. First, I'd like to address the blueprint. The blueprint that states that the Board of Corrections must create minimum standards, not only for those who are in general population who are lodged in city jails, but also we need to remove the exceptions of those who are lodged in punitive segregation units, as well as enhanced supervision housing. Why? Because they're human beings. Isolation, solitary confinement is inhumane and ineffective. It does not rehabilitate people. It only causes more damage to the human psyche, whereby once they're sent back into general population, it is unsafe for all who are lodged in general population. It's unsafe for correctional officers. Why? Because people become more angry, they become more damaged, and there is no healing in that process. It's also unsafe for those in the communities that they come back to. Why? Because they have not been rehabilitated. You're causing more harm to those who are already harmed in many ways. The words of the late Dr. Martin Luther King says, "An injustice anywhere is a threat, my God, to injustice everywhere." I'd like to give you a small testimony of a woman named Laura Rover, who is a human rights advocate and an attorney. Solitary confinement is human torture. It disproportionately impacts people of color. According to Laura Rover, who spoke of the devastations of solitary confinement, she says that people who are caged in solitary confinement doubt whether they have a self or even exist due to the lack of human contact or interaction or connection with the outside world. Laura went on to say that people lodged in solitary confinement are stuck in suspended animation, who are not part of a world that exists. They have been reduced to cutting themselves, talking through cracks in walls, to connect with someone just to maintain their humanity. Throwing feces out of anger, and at times many are led to no other alternative but to take their own lives, all because of the emotional devastations of isolation. Do you remember Khalif Browder? He's a prime example of what solitary confinement does to people. Solitary confinement is an endemic human rights concern that needs to be addressed, not now, but when? Right now. Not now, but when? Right now. Not now, but when? Right now. Solitary confinement is torture. It needs to end right now. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Rabbi Bara Elman. I am with the TRUA, the Rabbinic Voice for Human Rights. I'm also a professor who teaches with the Barred Prison Initiative, which is a college degree granting program in New York State prisons. I'm going to give my remarks, and if I have time, I have a couple extra things I want to add based on what some people have said. Solitary confinement is immoral. As is written in the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Genesis, Lo tov l'adam levado. It is not good for man to be alone. But it is also, in my experience as teaching at in New York State correctional facilities with the Barred Prison Initiative, debilitating and counterproductive. There are many obstacles to getting an education behind bars, and solitary confinement is one of the most disruptive, preventing students from completing coursework and sometimes forcing them to drop out of programs altogether. Add to this the lasting scars on the psyche, fear of closed spaces, social anxiety, depression, and even psychosis. It is clear that solitary confinement sets incarcerated people back, making it harder for them to emerge from behind bars as responsible citizens. I asked my students at Bard to share with me their experiences in solitary so that I could share them with you today, and I'm going to bring some quotes, just some excerpts from what they wrote to me. The shoe is living death. 360 days in the shoe for a false positive from poppy seeds on a breadstick? It's a nightmare. The correctional officers who resent our education know a misbehavior report can derail my education. And so, for the most insignificant things, involuntarily crossing a yellow line at the mess hall can put me in the shoe. When you get confined, they continue to degrade you and mess with your mentality. My time of confinement can be extended at the whim of an officer. Solitary confinement seems to strip me of my humanity. It is sensory deprivation for periods of 6 months or more. Food is scarce in the box. We are reduced to the bare minimum portions. Solitary confinement eliminates the social interactions and causes antisocial behavior, more aggression, more harm than good. You adapt to the animalistic situation that you're in, losing a grip on sanity. Confinement causes mental breakdown, psychotic behavior, insomnia. The men who shared these words with me are extraordinary, and like all the alumni of the Bard Prison Initiative and like all other such programs, are poised to make substantial, meaningful contributions to society. We mess them up at our peril. But not just them. All people in jails and prisons deserve to be treated humanely, and they do not deserve to endure the conditions that will traumatize them, that will further damage further damage them, rendering them dysfunctional, antisocial, and most likely to fail upon release. The part of the blueprint that really scares me are words like the least amount possible, the minimum, only as much as, I'm paraphrasing obviously, language that has a slippery slope that allows us to say we're not going to have confinement except when we really have to, or only for the least amount of time necessary. These are dangerous terms because these are the terms that make a wedge that open up the possibility for situations like one of my students who was in solitary from 2001 to 2004, 3 years. That's inhuman. That's totalitarian. We're seeing that happen in China with Uyghurs. You cannot have this happen. It is immoral. It is wrong. It doesn't work. That's it.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Trent Taylor. I was incarcerated for 16 and a half years for a crime I didn't do. And while the time I was on Rikers Island fighting this case, I was on Rikers Island for 2.5 years. And during those 2.5 years, 18 months of that time, I was in solitary confinement. I goes into the housing system, and it shows that you down with the program. I'm like, what did you talking about? What program? They said, you'll find out the hard way. I said, I'm here to try to deal with my case that I have nothing to do with. I just want to go home. So as I'm laying down, all of a sudden, they standing over. I'm like, why you standing over? They said, you're going to be down with the program, and you're going to get it the hard way. So I said, well, I'm not down with no program. They said, yes, you are. I said, no, I'm not. So they just started beating on me. I'm like, what you beating on me for? He said, you got to be down with the program. I said, I'm not down with no program. Then all of a sudden, they said, we got something for you. In the middle of the night, they just take me out and put me in the SHU. I'm like, what I'm going in here? You ain't down with the program. They said, we found a weapon. I said, you didn't find no weapon. As I'm standing here, is this medication I take up to today from getting beat in SHU. This is for dizziness. They constantly beat me, because I wasn't down with the program. Every movement I made, they made sure wherever I went, they made sure that they said, he's coming over there. I had hell. I had torture hell. My family was coming up. It was they couldn't even see me because they told them they had moved me to another jail, to another housing unit. But it wasn't. When they finally did get to see me, my eyes were swollen. Time they didn't want to take me to the pharmacy. I sitted on myself. They didn't give me no tissue. They said, you still gonna be down with the, I said, I'm not down with no program. I wound up taking 16 and a half years for a crime I didn't do just to get off that island. And it hurts. It really hurts. No one understands that feeling until they go through it. Now I'm opening up a wound that's hurting me. I'm speaking to you today. For the rest of my life, I'm dizzy. Here goes the medication right here. I'm taking. It hurts. It hurts. Just to understand that solitary confinement is no place for no one. It really hurt me. The days I could walk, I could just fall. I'm taking these 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and night. This is what happened in solitary confinement. This right here. I think no one should have to go through this. I'm standing up here crying because it's hurting, what I went through. I wouldn't want no one to go through this. As y'all right now, it's in y'all hands to stop all of this. As I got to say, now that you have heard my experience, I ask you to take responsibility as the Board of Corrections to finally end this torture. Advocates have provided you with a blueprint to end solitary confinement. You just have heard the courage. You just have to have the courage to put it into practice. Thank you. This is what I'm going through. Any minute I could walk and just pass out because of solitary confinement. I went in as a normal person. I came home to this. I don't think no one should go through this. It's in your decision. That's my story.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'll now call the next 3 speakers: Marvin Mayfield, Brandon Holmes, and Vidal Guzman. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Marvin Mayfield. I'm an organizer with Just Leadership USA, but more importantly, I'm a person, a survivor of Rikers Island and a survivor of solitary confinement. It's a very, an emotional thing for me to bring up sometimes. And just this morning, I was reminded of something because I woke up this morning with a little pain in my mouth, a slight toothache, nothing really bad, but I remember being in solitary confinement. I remember being in Rikers Island in C-95, and this is some years ago, when you wouldn't get out for an hour. You wouldn't be out for any period of time when you were in solitary confinement. My particular circumstances was that I was, at the time, diagnosed as having depression. And in the course of self-medicating, I ended up in Rikers Island with a misdemeanor, a drug possession charge. When I went in, I was, I guess, unresponsive. I wouldn't talk to medical staff. I wouldn't talk to anyone. And they put me in what they call the MO, right, the mental observation unit. And at that point in time, if you were not cooperating, you would go into solitary confinement. I don't care what you call it, mental observation, punitive segregation. If you're in that cell by yourself for 24 hours a day with nobody to look at you or to speak to you, it's solitary confinement. And make no mistakes about it. Solitary confinement is torture. I was tortured in there for 3 months. 3 months, just coming into Rikers Island. In the summer months when it was so hot that the walls sweat. And I heard somebody else testify this morning that said, or outside said that they laid on the floor to get air underneath the door. I did that, and at that point in time, I thought I was alone in trying to survive and save my life just to get a little bit of air underneath the door. And I'm not trying to say that correction officers are all heartless, but after seeing so much trauma, seeing so much abuse, seeing so much hardship, that they become desensitized to what happens to people, to what happens to human beings in solitary confinement. And every time I complained, right? Every time I complained about my conditions or what was, they would say, oh, well, you're just playing a role. Nobody believes you. Nobody believes you when you're suffering. And I talked about that toothache this morning. I remember sitting and being in solitary confinement and having a toothache and complaining about it. And it was one of the worst things that you can imagine. I mean, these are everyday occurrences that people can relate to, but to be in a position where you can't get help, where you can't get anything, where you're suffocating. People have died from heat exposure and overheating in these cells. People are still losing their lives. And I have seen where people have been dragged out and carried out feet first from cells in Rikers Island, from solitary confinement. We can do something better than what we've been doing. I know it's not an easy task, but together I believe that we can come to a conclusion to make our jails safer, more humane, because solitary confinement is torture. And I have been there and experienced it. And I'm sure there are people who will give you the facts and the figures and the data and everything else, but I want to drive home the human element and what it costs a person. Because from that day, I've never been the same. I can't even go in an elevator without feeling claustrophobic. I go in a subway. Up until that point in time, I didn't have these issues. Solitary causes more trauma than what a person has went in with. So I'm asking this board for the second time to testify before you to seriously commit yourselves to ending solitary confinement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is
Good
Brandon
morning.
Holmes. I'm testifying on behalf of Just Leadership USA and specifically the Close Rikers campaign. My family, cousins, aunts, uncles have survived Rikers Island, and 2 of them are currently surviving a federal facility in New York State and a state facility. The Close Rikers campaign counted a substantial victory many weeks ago when City Council voted to shrink the jail system by 75% and improve conditions for anyone still detained in New York City jails. And this is a part of that fight to improve those conditions, a part of that fight that cannot wait until we have new facilities or until we have a smaller DOC staff ratio. Our leaders who have lived the hell of Rikers Island and other city jails, and many other advocates in this room, have always said that new buildings will not be sufficient to achieve the massive culture transformation that is urgently needed in New York City jails, nor will they come soon enough to save tens of thousands of more people from abuse at the hands of the Department of Corrections. This board's role as a strong and independent oversight body is and will be essential to achieve real transformation. It will require each of you to have the courage to break and disrupt your old patterns of the exceptions, of the massive heaps of variances, because those patterns have resulted in countless trauma, injury, and the loss of lives at the hands of the Department of Corrections for decades. Today, we're demanding that the Board of Corrections take this oversight role very seriously and implement the blueprint to end solitary confinement. The question should not be whether or not we must end solitary confinement. This form of torture clearly has no place in our city. The question should be why the board has allowed it to continue for so long. Why was swift action not taken after the death of Jason Echevarria, or Khalif Browder, or Bradley Ballard, Layleen Polanco? If that action had been taken, would Layleen Polanco have lost her life? We all know the answer. This is also not an argument about whether or not safety matters. Of course it does. We care about the safety of everyone behind those walls. But solitary confinement does not create safety because it does not address the root cause of the violence. In fact, it creates more violence, a form of torture through mental and physical damage that it inflicts. people who have endured solitary and their families, mental health, legal, and human rights experts and advocates, with the New York City Jails Action Coalition and Halt Solitary campaign, have developed a very detailed plan to create safety through the type of deep engagement that can actually prevent this violence in the first place. That's what you should be passing. The blueprint asks the board to do 5 core things. 1, to ensure the Board of Correction minimum standards for out-of-cell time apply to all people in city jails, other than in specified emergencies, by removing exceptions to those standards for punitive segregation and enhanced supervision housing units. 2, create minimum standards for emergency individual lock-ins and emergency lockdowns. 3, end punitive segregation and make ESH and other alternative units actually about safety, rehabilitation, and preventing violence in the first place. 4, adopting specific mechanisms and time limits for getting out of ESH and other alternative units. And lastly, dramatically limit the use of restraints with a strong presumption against their use in the first place. We believe that every one of these things are reforms that New York City can and must implement now. This conversation about restrictive housing rulemaking must also be put in the context of ongoing and well-documented failures of this Department of Corrections that address the deep-seated culture of abuse, violence, and corruption in New York City jails. I submitted testimony before, and I will submit again this testimony that has specific anecdotes from the 8th report of the Nunez Independent Monitor Report from Monday, October 28th, that has proven, quote, the department has not shown itself capable of devising and implementing effective strategies to fully institutionalize the use of force reforms required by the consent judgment. And in the past 3 years, that use of force has increased 98%. I want to ask this board, as you consider changes to restrictive housing rules, is this a department that you really believe can and will exercise good judgment to determine if someone should be kept in isolation, knowing the deadly consequences that can come from doing that, knowing their failed decades of overseeing New York City jails? If you take your role seriously, you know the answer is no.
Thank you. Dr. Cohn, sir, there's a question.
Yep.
Could you elaborate a little bit on 2 of the points of the 5-point proposal, specifically individual status for lockdown, and then a mechanism? I mean, someone has said appropriately that best efforts or minimum, the minimum you're required is potentially a slippery slope. It's not, on the other hand, it's the only way to write rules. But in this case, what on restraints, what are the conditions that you would do? And before that, the individualized lockdown plans that you described, if you could.
Yep. So that first one was individual lockdown plans. Creating the minimum standards, there needs to be transparency. And there needs to be a clear set of those minimum standards. I'm not, unfortunately, as an organizer, not in a position to determine what those minimum standards should be, and we would all continue to mobilize and be here to see what you propose. But we need transparency. We need to be very clear what those standards are going to be so that we know what we're holding people accountable to.
You were talking about an individualized response.
That would be taking somebody out of a situation instead of solitary confinement. Could you describe?
I think what I'm appreciating is, and I don't want to speak for you, but you're raising, you're opening up the issue and saying we need to take a look at this. You may not have any specific, definitive ways of doing it at this point, but you want us to really explore this. Is that correct?
Yes, explore that, and also which we'll also be submitting with our testimony, the blueprint to end solitary from Halt Solitary and New York City Jails Action Coalition. We'll have more details about that, but specifically, we want to see action on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
If I may ask, there's a transcript, this is recorded, but if you have today written testimony that you are willing to hand over to us, please provide that so we have that sooner rather than later, and we don't have to wait on the transcript so we can look at some of the particulars sooner rather than later. That would be helpful.
Yep, we can do that. And, sorry, Commissioner Cohen, you had another question?
I'll look for that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Someone else wants to address those specific questions. Sorry. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Vidal Guzman. First, I want to talk about I was incarcerated for 7 years. First time I was incarcerated, I was 16, 17 years old. I did 2 years on Rikers Island, awaiting trial. Came home when I was 18, and this one, the life changing of my life kind of changed. My neighborhood was beefing for the last 17 years, my block and a different block. And I was at that point at a high-ranking member of the Bloods, and we was actually beefing with a neighborhood that I grew up in, right? My brother was locked up for 16 years. And when I got reincarcerated again at 19 years old, that beef from that neighborhood followed, right? I heard correctional officers talking about violence and people carrying weapons. Well, I was one of those. I was one of the individuals that carried a weapon, knowing that my life was in danger every single day. Not because it was a fight or a scuffle that happens when we see each other, right? Because all I know, even problems from certain neighborhoods follow you to prisons and jails, right? For anyone who actually been incarcerated. So for me, I was in GMDC already doing time, and I heard that some people from the neighborhood that I was beefing with actually landed in there. One of the things for me was how to make a weapon, when I'm gonna do it, and how long it's gonna take me to do it. I was at any case, was gonna use it, right? Because I knew my life was endangered, I knew my life had to do something. So for the past year and a half when I was in Rikers, fights between neighborhoods, even this other neighbor I was beefing with was still blood at the same time, right? When I landed into upstate Green Correctional Facility, I was involved with a program called AVP. AVP got more involved. AVP is a Alternative Violent Program that's facilitated by people inside. And this is where I come to the certain point. People in the prison itself knew that it was time for people to create peace, right? So elders that was actually inside the facility sat me down and certain people from the neighborhood and figured out where was the meeting point at, about how do we actually start creating peace between each other. And for that time me being there, a beef that was a 17-year-old beef ended because of Alternative Violent Program. There's abilities when we hear correctional officers talking about how pulling someone in solitary confinement stops issues. No, it don't. If you put me in a room and I know my life is in danger, I'm gonna make a weapon out of anything because my life is in danger. When you're in danger, if you've ever been in danger, that means your life is in danger, and that means you're gonna do anything it means to survive. So I know being in solitary confinement for 912 days, I was in solitary confinement 2.5 years. A lot of y'all do the count as 912 days. I know what it means to be there, and I also know what it means to see stories and hear people's voices and hear people cry at night. I also know what it means to take a bird bath. I also know what it means, what land people who are a part of that gang culture in that facility or in solitary confinement. You putting someone in solitary confinement, no matter gang culture or because you feel like pulling them in solitary confinement stops them from ending violence, it doesn't, right? You can put me in solitary confinement if I know once I leave out these walls or out this cell that I have beef with someone, then I'm gonna do whatever it means to survive. I've been through a situation, I know a lot of people who've been in solitary confinement as myself and was a part of that gang culture would do anything means necessary. Like, what we need to really think about, and I'm gonna finish this with 20 seconds, is the ability to how do we make sure that we get to the root cause of violence, and how do we make sure that people don't carry weapons in the first place? And there's a real certain part as a collective of us saying ending solitary confinement is the ability to think farther about how do we implement programs that talks about how do we make sure that this person doesn't carry a weapon? How do we make sure that we have conversation around peace and around feeling safe? Because through my own experience and being in the gang culture and also being a member of the Bloods, is that one of the things that I learned, ending solitary has to be done, but we also have to think about programs that are being created, programs that I went through that created real safety in my neighborhood. And you ask me right now, and this is the last thing I want to end, my neighborhood and the neighborhood we was beefing with, we've been at 3 years of peace, 3.5 years of peace, and that was because of the AVP program that actually sat us down as adults and said, what happened, how can we help you out, and how can we stop y'all from going to solitary confinement? So we can end solitary confinement, and I really want to say that from my story, and I know I shocked you saying carrying weapons, but if you ever been incarcerated and you was a part of that gang culture, you would do anything in means necessary to survive. I've seen people get poked, slapped, and everything, but I know what can happen if someone had programs that don't lead them there. So I want to end like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guzman. I'm going to call the next 3 speakers. Gina Farinaccio, Herbert Murray, and Harvey Murphy. Good morning.
Morning. Hello. How are you all? My name is Gina Farinaccio. I'm a social work intern at Brooklyn Defender Services working on jail policy. We applaud the board for undertaking this rulemaking process, but urge you to ensure the rule is comprehensive and addresses the entire scope of restrictive housing tactics used by the department before finalizing the rule in the coming months. Before I go on, I just want to take a moment of respect for all the people here who have experienced solitary confinement and come here to share their stories today. So thank all of you. One of the most common tactics that the DOC uses to isolate and segregate people is restrictive classifications. Yet, as written, the proposed rules contain no mention of these restrictive classifications that are a major form of restrictive housing. The restrictive classifications have a significant, harmful impact that undermines any rehabilitative purpose that the department allegedly seeks to serve. For instance, restrictive classifications allow DOC to deny broad groups of people access to important programs that support people with substance use disorders. The justification is that these people are classified as high security by DOC or are the subject of unsubstantiated gang allegations based on no standard of evidence and with no meaningful opportunity to appeal. Yet the impact of these classifications is to deny access to some of the people who need these programs the most. In a recent case, one BDS criminal defense attorney successfully advocated that her client, who had a history of substance abuse, would serve reduced jail time if he participated in a program for people struggling with addiction. Despite the agreement from the client's parole officer and the district attorney, the attorney learned that the correctional health services that the client was denied entry into the program because of his high security classification, which was a result of a more than decade-old incarceration where DOC identified him as gang affiliated. Although the client was not in a gang and was fully committed to participating in the program and turning his life around, he was not able to move forward with the agreement because of his outdated restrictive classification. These classifications prevent people from bettering themselves and working towards a new life. Not only do they render rehabilitative efforts ineffective, they actually obstruct the goal of creating a safe and secure environment. These classifications severely limit access to programming, mental health services, law library, and counsel visits, either because these services are not provided or because there is an excessive wait time for the single escort assigned to the unit. Once someone is placed in these classifications, problems with access to care and programming are exacerbated. Officers have even more control over access to sick call and other services, and securing escorts to and from high security units is extremely difficult. Another BDS client described moving from GP to a high classification housing unit. In his new unit, he was no longer sleeping in a dorm, but rather confined to a single cell by himself during lock-in, a situation he said he, quote, could not handle. His access to mental health services was severely reduced as he had no choice but to rely on the single escort to bring him to appointments. For this client, instead of seeing mental health services every day, it became more like once every 3 weeks. Since his move, his mental health has decompensated dramatically as despondence and suicidal ideation has become the norm. It is essential that BOC address restrictive classifications in the rules around restrictive housing. Currently, the department does not provide any due process when designating people one of these restrictive classifications or address any duration, conditions, or terms for being removed from these classifications. DOC has shown time and again that, given the opportunity, they will find loopholes in the minimum standards to maintain the most harmful practices. In conclusion, I want to reiterate that BOC, the Board of Corrections, you guys, should address the restrictive classifications alongside restrictive housing in this rulemaking. I echo and support the comments by my colleagues at Legal Aid Society, UJC, Jack and Halt Solitary Confinement, and I ask you and I implore you to implement the blueprint to end solitary confinement. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question, Dr. Cohn.
So you're not talking about red ID or enhanced restraint housing. You're talking about a classification?
Yeah, the restrictive classifications for restrictive housing.
Maximum, medium, you're talking about? I mean,
Yeah.
You mean like when people go in, they give them a
Right.
classification?
Yeah.
Which means they can
No,
go to the dorm.
and the housing in dorm versus cell, I mean, there are different kinds, you know,
Right.
obviously for different
Right,
classifications. So.
We're talking about specific rules for restrictive.
And what facility were you referencing?
All of them? Which one?
Well, the one
Sorry,
you gave
I'm-
examples of individuals.
I'm
I'm
looking
sorry.
to, oh, the BDS clients?
Yeah.
Those were, what?
AMKC?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Murray? Good morning.
Good morning. First and foremost, I appreciate y'all having this conversation with us, those, especially those who've been impacted, because it is very critical that we eliminated solitary confinement. My name is Herbert Murray. When I was 21 years old, I was arrested for a murder I didn't commit. But after 2 years and 2 trials, I was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years to life. Subsequently, I did 29 years in prison. Between Brooklyn Houses of Detention, Rikers Island, and Upstate Correction Facility, I did approximately 10 years in solitary confinement. I used to become so angry because of my being alone and isolated. I still talk to myself because of not having no one to talk to for so many years of being isolated. I remember my anger became so threatening to myself and others. I started drinking sleeping medication so I wouldn't harm myself or others. When former Governor George Pataki came into office, he built special housing units, S blocks, that required 2 people, not 1 person, but 2 people in a cell in solitary confinement. And I heard those stories, how people have been raped, assaulted, in some cases murdered, but it was covered. On one occasion, they placed a mentally disturbed person in the same cell with me. Every time I woke up, he would be standing over me, just smiling. And as I mentioned, the stories that I heard from people in S blocks was unbelievable. I've been home 12 years, and the effects of solitary confinement still haunt me when it comes to family and relationship. I tried living with a female on 2 different occasions, but each time I moved out because I wanted to be alone. I did not adjust. I don't think a person could ever adjust being locked in a cage like an animal. it just halts you on and on and on, because when those lights are cut off, your mind starts thinking. And the worst thing that you can imagine come to you. And you try to overcome it, and you can't. I am just beginning to really get a grip on my anger from being isolated so many years. No form of being in jail within a jail cell that's not equipped for a dog will promote good behavior under no circumstances. You cannot do it. And DOC are very abusive. And who's going to make those decisions when we're sitting before the committee? And he give us 90 days, and then he supposedly only gave us 10 days. Who's watching? Who's really watching? Solitary confinement is torture. It has caused physical, psychological, and emotional harm. New York City must take immediate action to finally end solitary confinement in its entirety and develop effective programs that will assist in the growth of the individual as opposed to causing more harm to the person. In closing, adopt the blueprint that Just Leadership USA formulated to halt solitary confinement in its entirety. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Harvey Murphy. I'm from Just Leadership USA. I just want to give a shout out to my individuals that get up here and speak about their stories. And honestly, just hearing their stories is triggering. Is very, very triggering at me. Knowing I had to deal with I dealt with solitary confinement. I just want to paint this picture to you guys, right? Just try to imagine, right? You walking up on a cage with a stick, and a dog is inside the cage. And you take the stick, and you keep poking at the dog. You keep poking at the dog. You just keep poking at this dog. Eventually, this dog is going to have an attitude. This dog is going to be upset. I'm a little upset right now, but it's honestly an honor to be up here to speak about the indifferences, because people is dealing with solitary confinement as we speak. Just that picture of a dog in a cage and somebody just poking at it and just keep poking at it. I was the animal that was in cell 22. It was don't feed cell 22. Give cell 22 the loaf. He's an animal. You know, I had a whole song and a dance. I had a whole speech up here, but when I sit down and I hear these stories, it's just real triggering. It's triggering because I was that animal in cell 22. I was chained to a desk as a kid. How do we expect to learn when you're being called an animal? You're being treated like an animal. I was chained to a desk to take a midterm when I was incarcerated on Rikers Island. I couldn't even function right because the CO just put the cuffs just a little too tight on my ankle. I asked the teacher, I complained about it. Nobody did nothing. I just want to say it's a pleasure and it's an honor to hear my comrades speak about the in-depths, because it hurts, man. It hurts. And it takes a lot of courage, man. And honestly, I don't even have the courage to stand up here. I had a whole speech. But again, hearing my comrades speak about the in-depths and then think about the situation that I dealt with, I'm not an animal, y'all. I'm a highly respected member of my community. I go to church. I'm a community organizer for Just Leadership USA. I met this man in Fortress Society. I'm not no animal, y'all. I'm a human being. So I ask that we treat people like human beings. I just want to say I thank you, y'all.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your words. I'm going to call the next three people to testify: Irene Sedano, Simone Spirig, and Julia Solomons.
Good morning. My name is Irene Sedano. I'm a jail services advocate at Brooklyn Defender Services. I echo the comments this morning made by my colleagues at the Legal Aid Society, the Urban Justice Center, the New York City Jails Action Coalition, and the Hall Solitary Campaign. My comments this morning will focus on the need to define out-of-cell time, the importance of meaningful and qualitative programs, and existing barriers to meaningful out-of-cell time that must be addressed as we move forward in rulemaking. I visit incarcerated people in New York City jails every week and advocate for their welfare and basic human rights. Time and again, I hear commonalities amongst people, especially young people, housed in special units, who are not afforded basic information about their unit, including how much out-of-cell time they get or what it should look like. When these people, or my colleagues and I, as their advocates, reach out to the department, we're met with a semantic battle over the term restrictive housing rather than a meaningful plan to provide necessary services. No one can question the critical role meaningful out-of-cell time plays in preventing decompensation and ensuring the most basic level of safety for people who are isolated in restrictive housing. Medical professionals, security experts, human rights scholars, and advocates have all stressed that people in isolation must have access to out-of-cell time and that that time must be meaningful. Despite near-universal agreement on the importance of meaningful out-of-cell time, the department fails time and again to provide appropriate and sufficient out-of-cell time for people in their custody. The board is well aware of this deficiency. In your report on ESH in 2017, board staff recognized that people aren't afforded the requisite time out of cell due to staff shortages and staff running late to their post. Nonetheless, the proposed rules ignores this systematic shortcoming by failing to define meaningful out-of-cell time and foregoing necessary safeguards. What should out-of-cell time look like? The concept that out-of-cell time should be meaningful stems from the Mandela rules adopted by the United Nations. Those rules relied on the concept of meaningful human contact to define isolation. The United Nations recognized that human beings require mental, physical, and emotional contact to survive. The American Bar Association has similarly recognized that all people, including those in segregation, be provided meaningful forms of mental, physical, and social stimulation. Inherent in those concepts is a reality that incidental or obligatory contact is insufficient. If out-of-cell time is compromised of walking handcuffed through a corridor, listening to commands of an officer as he escorts you to an appointment, or answering a medical provider's questions through a door, the whole purpose of out-of-cell time is undermined. Instead, people must have engaging face-to-face interaction with other human beings. Equally important, people must not be forced to choose between basic health or legal obligations and the opportunity to participate in meaningful, engaging programming. If legal visits, showers, or medical appointments count as out-of-cell time, the notion of mental, physical, and social stimulation is completely lost. These concepts must be inherent in these rules, and we urge the board to define adequate out-of-cell time that is meaningful and not merely compromised of incidental or obligatory contact. The reality for many of our clients is that out-of-cell time is exactly the type of incidental contact that the United Nations and the American Bar Association have sought to exclude. People in our jails regularly wait hours for escorts to bring them to visits, appointments, and programs. Just a week ago, I waited over 2 hours to meet with a person housed in True, a form of restrictive housing at RNDC. While the man I was meeting sat in a day room, confused and anxious as he waited for an escort. After our visits, the same man waited over an hour before DOC arrived to take him back to his housing area. While the man was technically out of his cell for approximately 4 hours for a legal visit, none of it was the type of meaningful engagement that the United Nations and the American Bar Association recognize is critical. Even if the time the man spent in the actual meeting were to count towards out-of-cell time, more than 3/4 of his out-of-cell time did not include mental, physical, or social stimulation at all as he waited for an escort. This is not unique to council visits nor to people in True. The amount of time people wait due to lack of escorts by the department is staggering. The department was not be allowed to rely on inadequate staffing or insufficient management to further isolate people during time physically outside of their cells. Contrary to Commissioner Brand's suggestion, legal visits, court appearances, medical appointments, and basic hygiene should not be seen as amenities, but rather a necessity. Equally problematic, certain units by design prevent people from any meaningful human out-of-cell time. Units designed so that when a person leaves their cage of a cell, they only enter into another cage, violate the entire concept and spirit of meaningful out-of-cell time. We recently represented a young man who was held in a restraint unit in NYC. Anytime he was allowed to leave his cell, presumably for mandated out-of-cell time, he was only allowed to go a few feet out of his physical cell, but remained literally caged, alone, and isolated. These units provide none of the meaningful stimulation that is critical to counteracting at least some of the torture of these units. I urge the board to ensure that meaningful out-of-cell time is just that, meaningful and out of a cell. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Simone Speard, and I'm the Jail Services Social Worker at Brooklyn Defender Services. Each week, I visit people from across New York who are incarcerated in our city's jails, and I've repeatedly seen the department create new units to isolate people under the guise of security concerns. Each time, they do so without transparency or accountability for the novel approach. Housing and security designations, including separation status and deadlock, are forms of extreme isolation used by DOC that deny people's basic human necessities with no meaningful way to appeal and without any imposed time limitations. The board should no longer be complicit in the torture of people in our city's jails. In the past month alone, I've met with 3 people who have been subjected to deadlock status. While on deadlock, my clients were denied access to all services, including phone, showers, rec, and law library. All 3 were subjected to 24 hours locked inside their individual cell in a general population housing unit. This extreme restriction in what are supposed to be regular general population units highlights the lack of oversight by the board and demonstrates how the department can and does regularly bypass minimum standards designed to protect people who are incarcerated. I'd like to share the words of a person I met recently who was held on deadlock status. I'm already an inmate. The little freedoms I had access to without a warning are suddenly denied. I'm reduced to a mere pet on the top tier that the CEOs are reluctant to do the bare minimum for, such as feeding me, and I was lucky to even get that. Food is slid under the bottom of a dirty, filthy, dusty cell door. I didn't have access to a shower or a phone call. There's barely any communication at all. I felt like a leper, like I was ostracized. All I'm told, if I'm told anything at all, is that it's a security issue. Stage 1 is anxiety, which is the first to start kicking in. My Nana had just recently passed. I'm going back and forth to criminal and family court, and now I'm deadlocked. The DOC is dragging their feet to get me down to medical. After a while, my rationale becomes that the DOC is trying to kill me. Days go by and still nothing. I'm able to tell the time that has passed in the days based on my meal time, if my meals even come. Sometimes people in the house would slide snacks or food under my door for me to eat, but without my cell door getting open, how am I getting hot water to make a soup? Stage 2 is depression. I'm reduced to a state of something subhuman. I still haven't received a shower or a phone call going on a few days now. Slowly, I start becoming sullen and withdrawn. To use the word inhumane still wouldn't accurately describe the way I was being handled or how I just had to deal with it. I wasn't even afforded my religious services, and in situations like this, faith is definitely needed. But in my case, I'm just a number of a cell. Stage 3 is suicidal thoughts. It wasn't really like I was trying to kill myself, but more so I just wanted out of the cell bad enough, I'm ready to run headfirst into the walls. It's like Zora Neale Hurston said, if you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. I urge the board to go further during this rulemaking process. If we're serious about treating those we incarcerate like human beings, the rules need to be comprehensive and eliminate any possibility of violating the minimum standards. The board must not rubber stamp the department's request to continuously and indefinitely isolate people in our city's jails. The board needs to demand transparency. We need to address these concerning conditions and have meaningful protocols in place for all forms of isolation, not just some. And I just want to add quickly that I think it's pretty shameful that none of the department is here today to listen to our testimony and be part of this process. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing deadlock status to our attention.
We're going to follow up on the deadlock issue. I'm embarrassed that I was not aware of this. I mean, terrible things happen on Rikers Island. There's certainly no policy called deadlock. Any officer who does it should not be able to do it if the department is aware of it. That's unacceptable. It doesn't mean there are a million other unacceptable things here, but I've never even heard the word deadlock before. And I promise you that the board will investigate this. And if you could provide the names of individuals who would agree to be interviewed about this, I'll be on Rikers on Thursday.
And the facility. The facility as well.
The facility as well. Names and facilities would be helpful.
Thank you. We'll follow up. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair
Good morning.
Sherman and members of the board. My name is Julia Solomons. I'm a social worker and policy advocate with the Bronx Defenders. I'm also a member of the Jails Action Coalition. I'm here today both to commend the board in taking this long-awaited step in proposing a new rule with regard to restrictive housing, as well as to express our grave concern that this rule will not achieve the desired results, especially with regard to due process and procedural justice for people in custody. As public defenders, we know how critical the right to due process is, and the only way to ensure true due process is to grant our clients and all people in custody the right to legal representation in the disciplinary process. It's very likely that the number of people sanctioned to restrictive housing would be greatly reduced if there was true due process in every hearing, and that would change this conversation entirely. While we support the board's requirement of videotaping refusals for disciplinary hearings in the proposed rule, we do not believe it suffices if we truly aim to achieve procedural justice. No one should ever receive an infraction that has an accompanying consequence without a fair hearing, and a hearing cannot truly be fair without the right to have an attorney or advocate present at that hearing. Our clients regularly report that they are not produced for their disciplinary hearings. Twice in the past 2 weeks, we've received reports that our clients were sentenced to time and punitive segregation without being present at the hearing. The department documented it as a refusal, but our clients were never notified. Our clients perceive this process as stacked against them and believe that the hearings exist in name only, so often do not even try to fight for themselves because they believe that their efforts are fruitless. The power dynamic in an incarcerated setting is such that there is no true procedural justice without the right to an advocate. We see that especially when infractions pertain to an interaction with an officer, our clients' rights are compromised. They are retaliated against by the department in the form of denial of video conferences, their 1 hour of rec time, and sometimes incidents as egregious as glass in their food. Defense attorneys and advocates, as a matter of course, follow our clients to collateral hearings at the DMV and family court and elsewhere. Allowing an advocate to be present at these disciplinary hearings would not require additional resources on the part of the department, but simply a notification to defense counsel. Additionally, we believe that 7 days is far too long to hold someone in pre-hearing detention, defined as such in the proposed rule. From arrest to arraignment in the 5 boroughs, 24 hours is a standard wait time and requires far more coordination amongst more parties than a disciplinary hearing requires within the jail. There is no reason someone should serve half of the United Nations standard of torture, 15 days, before any opportunity to prove their innocence. Unfortunately, 4 minutes is not long enough for me to detail the horror stories that we hear from our clients that are experiencing isolation in all of its forms, but we will provide more detail in that regard in our written submission. I do want to briefly highlight the positive feedback that we hear about the CAPS unit, the Clinical Alternatives to Punitive Segregation. We have actually seen our clients make real positive changes while on that unit, and this is because true support and addressing of individual needs is what actually changes behavior. We see absolutely no reason that the CAPS model cannot be applied universally to all people in custody. For this reason and many others, we, along with many advocates that have already testified here today, as well as elected officials, strongly support and believe in the blueprint to end solitary confinement created by the Jails Action Coalition and the Halt Solitary campaign. This is absolutely our clearest road forward towards providing people in custody with real avenues for transformative change and thus creating true culture change and increased safety within our city jails. We implore you, the board, as an oversight body, to please take real, undiluted action on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Cohn?
Yeah, I have two questions. The issue of representation. We've discussed this with, this was something that was considered and not present in the final version of the rule. Mm-hmm. One of the responses was the cost of the city of having counter representation, which I think is a legitimate question, and I wonder if you had any comment on that. And the second, I'm concerned about people, since it is now the department's policy to arrest people for infractions, not in all cases, but as a particular. It's the department's policy and it's the Bronx DA's policy. This is a way that she and that the commissioner and the Bronx DA are committed to addressing violence is by arresting people for infractions. Mm-hmm. Then, do you have a comment on the problem of giving testimony in a infraction hearing when someone is facing stay time in the Bronx?
Right. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. I think that's one of the reasons why we think it's critical to have defense counsel at those hearings, because it is true that if someone says something on the record at one of those hearings, it can be used against them in a criminal court proceeding. And so for that reason, their defense attorney should absolutely be present. As to your first question, I think we can sort of lay out a more comprehensive plan for how access to counsel could work in disciplinary hearings, but I think if we were notified that our clients had a disciplinary hearing, at least I can speak for the Bronx Defenders, we would do everything in our power to send an advocate, and it wouldn't necessarily need to be an attorney, but just an advocate to be present with them at that hearing to create some sense of balance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to call on Public Advocate Jamani Williams. After the Public Advocate gives his testimony, we are going to take a very, very brief break. We're going to take a 5-minute break after the Public Advocate gives his testimony.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jamani Williams. I'm the Public Advocate for the City of New York. I just want to thank everybody for being here and for you allowing this testimony. As the city's watchdog, it is my duty to protect the rights of all New Yorkers, including the roughly 7,000 New Yorkers who are housed in the Department of Correction DOC facilities. Again, I'd like to thank the board for holding this hearing and giving the public an opportunity to have their voices heard on this critically important proposed rule. A member of my team testified at the board's October 22nd meeting. Restrictive housing, punitive segregation, separation status, whatever we call it, solitary confinement is a torturous punishment that causes deep and permanent psychological, physical, and social harm. It has been proven to be ineffective, counterproductive, and unsafe disciplinary practice that fails to address the underlying cause of problematic behavior. We must end solitary confinement in the City of New York now. The board's rule must be revised to reflect this moral imperative. 15 days in solitary confinement is 15 days too long. Through this rulemaking process, New York City has an opportunity to serve as a model for the nation in defending basic human rights. I call on the board to fully end solitary confinement in New York City by adopting the comprehensive blueprint put forward by the New York City Jails Action Coalition and the Halt Solitary campaign. As this blueprint makes clear, ending solitary confinement does not require a radical overhaul of existing protocols. In order to end this shameful chapter in our city's history, we need to strengthen existing standards and follow the example of previous efforts that have successfully replaced punitive segregation with alternatives that prioritize rehabilitation, health, safety, and basic human rights. One specific example that I want to raise is the Clinical Alternative to Punitive Segregation, or CAPS, program that has already been implemented in New York City jails for those living with serious mental illness. Instead of placing folks in solitary units that only exacerbate existing behavioral problems, the program provides intense programming, out-of-cell time, therapy, and recreation activities. This has resulted in improved outcomes and safety, including a significant decrease in self-harm and injury. The success of CAP should not be confined to those serious mental illness. For those with serious mental illness. This approach can and should be applied for all New Yorkers in DOC facilities. I'll end by saying that the stakes are too high here for this city to be taking half measures and exploiting bureaucratic loopholes that continue the practice of solitary confinement. Passing emergency variances for so-called separation status, issuing substitution orders to send young New York City residents to sit in solitary cells upstate, and capitulating to watered-down rules like the ones before us today are how we end up with more tragedies like the preventable deaths of Lelian Polanco and Khalif Browder. We can and we must end solitary confinement in New York City, and I implore the board to revise and pass rules that will make this happen. Thank you for your time and consideration. I do want to say it took me a while to get to this position. I was not automatically there. My staff will tell you through many conversations so I can fully understand. And what came to me is that we have been having a discussion and confusing separation with isolation. And I think most folks understand if there is a problematic behavioral problem, we do need to separate someone to get that corrected. But that does not mean we have to isolate them. And that is where the torturous behavior becomes. So I think there are programs that are in place that can get what we need to get without the isolation that we know not only cause damage to the person, but if it was a problem solver, I think the problems would have been solved already. And I just keep hearing about more violence that is occurring, not less. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming today. As stated, we're going to take a very brief break. We will return in 5 minutes. I'm going to call the next three speakers. Julia Davis, Claudia Forrester, and Jessica Young. Okay, Mick Kincaid. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Julia Davis, and I'm with the Children's Defense Fund. It's nice to see all of you again today. I want to acknowledge that the department is not here, and I think it's an important fact as we think about the work going forward, and we think about the types of ideas and questions and comments that have come from the community and have come from the board itself that remain unanswered. And while the advocates who have been so engaged in this process have been described as anonymous, as influencing this process in ways that suggest that we are somehow acting in an untoward manner, we are the ones here today testifying publicly on the record about where this work needs to go. I want to start with the young adult plan and the fact that the language in the current proposal actually strikes the duty to provide programming to young people. Not only have we seen a retreat from this programmatically in the jails, which I know that you're aware of, but what we see in these proposed rules is language that actually strikes that obligation altogether. While there's a duty to report on the young adult plan, there's actually no duty there to provide those services. We also think that the language in that section around the young adults needs to clarify that all young adults need to have access to programming and services regardless of what housing area they are ultimately placed in. With regard to the young adult housing areas, the proposal also changes the duty around that. Young adults, since this board initiated the reforms to end solitary confinement, were intentionally seen as a group that has unique needs. You know that. The housing areas are supposed to meet those needs and to address what we know is inevitable, which is conflict and violence among young people. So the proposal, which actually short-circuits that and sends young people involved in violence or conflict outside of those settings, is really counterproductive. And it doesn't make sense with the obligations that you've set forth that the department create a reasonable discipline plan for young people, one that actually incorporates concepts of restorative justice. So while there will be inevitably temporary times when young people have to come out of these settings, they must be returned, and there has to be a process for them to return, because we know that these settings are actually created for their benefit, and that's where they get services. So you'll see in my written comment that we've submitted some detailed suggestions around those types of revisions. Let's talk about the discipline. The absence of an operative discipline program in the jails is something that the Nunez Monitor highlighted as a major contributor to the violence and the abuses of young people. The department offered no insight on that at the last meeting. And currently, your proposal requires the department to first seek and obtain approval by the Nunez Monitor before they even submit a plan to you. And that's absolutely unacceptable. You are an independent body. You have the opportunity to review and approve an appropriate discipline plan. You've set forth the boundaries of that plan in your proposal. You know what you need. The department should have to prepare one, submit it to you, and implement it. We cannot wait for the Nunez Monitor. The shackling of young people is outrageous. We have to end it immediately. The department is already operating at Horizon without shackling young people. They've been doing it for a year. It's incredibly frustrating that they have convinced you that they need more time to phase out that process when they've already been doing it. That needs to stop immediately, not only in individualized use, but for generalized use, for any kind of use. It's simply inappropriate and it's counterproductive to the types of reforms you want to see. With regard to punitive segregation, I'll just say that what we have proposed will not work. Putting young people, and by that I mean people over the age of 21 and under the age of 25, or any people on the island in this type of isolation for sustained periods, will not reduce the violence. What we have to do is consider an alternative approach that responds to the needs of people, that capitalizes on the works of CAPS, that capitalizes on what we know actually promotes safety. And that's the direction this board must go in. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
My name is Claudia Forrester, and I'm a jail services advocate at Brooklyn Defender Services, and I visit people incarcerated on Rikers Island on a weekly basis. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. I want to echo the recommendations raised by formerly and currently incarcerated people who have direct experience with the horrors of isolation, as well as the advocates here today. My comments will focus on the exclusions for the various restrictive housing units and the shameful lack of time limits on most forms of restrictive housing. I stand with the blueprint for ending solitary in New York jails to ensure that the Board of Correction minimum standards for out-of-cell time apply to all people in city jails by removing exceptions to those standards for punitive segregation and ESH units. In the proposed rules and in countless comments made in the board's meetings, the board implicitly acknowledges time and again how dangerous these units are for all people. Yet the rules themselves don't go far enough to limit these harms. While the proposed rules increase required out-of-cell time in punitive segregation, 4 hours out of cell is simply not enough to ensure that people are safe mentally and physically. The rules themselves acknowledge this reality in the exclusions. While it is justified to recognize that the conditions in ESH and PSEG-1 are not appropriate for pregnant women, young adults, and other vulnerable populations, social and medical science demonstrates that such conditions are not humane for anyone. Even more troubling, though, is the arbitrary nature of the different levels of exclusions for the different restrictive housing. If it is dangerous for pregnant people and people over the age of 50 to be subjected to PSEG-1, why is it okay for them to be in PSEG-2? Isolation is dangerous for anyone, and allowing these vulnerable people to be caged alone in a cell for 17 hours a day in PSEG-2, as opposed to 20 hours a day in PSEG-1, is careless at best and willful blindness to the dangers at worst. Not to mention that the proposed rules provide no time limit for incarceration in PSEG-2, meaning 17-hour-a-day lock-in could be indefinite. Subjecting a pregnant person to any level of restrictive housing is barbaric. In 2015, the Correctional Association of New York released a report stating that solitary is especially dangerous for pregnant women because it impedes access to critical OB care and prevents women from getting the regular exercise and movement that are vital for a healthy pregnancy. High levels of stress are hazardous for pregnant women, lowering their ability to fight infection and increasing the risk of preterm labor, miscarriage, and low birth weight in babies. Restrictive housing almost guarantees that incarcerated people will leave isolation as less healthy individuals. This is even more true for individuals over the age of 50. 2018 Yale University research on solitary confinement recognized that when subjected to a lack of physical exercise and loneliness, older adults have an elevated risk for the earlier onset of dementia, physical deconditioning that results in a heightened risk of falls, vitamin D deficiency, and cardiovascular disease. Equally disturbing, these proposed rules allow DOC to isolate young people, despite data that confirms that restrictive housing causes permanent developmental damage. Back in 2015, the mayor announced the elimination of solitary confinement for adolescents and young adults because of this reality. Yet today we are discussing rules which allow young people to be placed in restrictive housing, again without time limits. Rather than representing bold progress that is warranted after the deaths of too many New Yorkers, including Khalif Browder and Layleen Polanco, these proposed rules only codify years' worth of variances requested by the department. In 2014, this board voted to exclude young adults from ESH, but now the proposed rules that you release would subject young people whose brains are still developing to torturous conditions of restrictive housing, all without a clear path to advance out of the unit or strict time limits that would prevent the indefinite placement in such units. This is a shameful step backwards. No one should be subjected to the dangerous conditions of restrictive housing, but at the very least, the board should exclude those individuals most at risk from all levels of restrictive housing. For our young people and our older people, for pregnant people, and for all people. It is ironic that the reasoning behind restrictive housing is always safety. Yet the research and data unanimously shows that when we isolate people and treat them as less deserving, we actually make our jails and our communities unsafe. We urge the board to extend the exclusions and to impose strict and set time limits for each and every form of restrictive housing. To truly meet the security goal, we must invest in the strategies that uplift people and decrease violence rather than signing on to torture people indefinitely. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Hi. So the last time I testified before you all, I was with the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. I'm now with Legal Aid Society. My testimony today is going to focus on the reentry services that I provide, and then I also have two short statements from transgender women currently within the city jails that I'm going to read at the end. So in my new position, I am at EMTC every Friday and RMSC every Thursday, and I still do my two classes between the Trans Housing Unit in 4 South A and the General Population Trans Unit in 3 South A. The services I provide are general civil legal services. So anything from eviction prevention to benefit support to getting your IDs back to correcting your name. These are the services that I offer. And the way the client meets with me is that they have to be escorted from their housing unit to the support center where I sit with the other benefits workers who do things like turn on your Medicaid and turn on your food stamps. When I first got this position, I thought it was interesting that there were so many civilian workers who were doing this Medicaid and food stamp position, because I had hardly ever had a client come home with their Medicaid turned on and with their food stamps turned on. That almost always was something we had to do afterwards. And so I was excited and interested to hear that there were so many folks in the city jails doing this. And one of the reasons I've now found out that so few of my clients in the past have come home with their benefits on is because, generally speaking, if you're in restrictive housing, you do not get these services. So on average, my weekly calendar is between 10 to 12 people to meet with, and I actually meet with 7 to 8 people. And the reason that these folks don't come down to meet with me is because of restrictive housing. I'm never told the specifics. Like, I'm never told this person is in True or this person is in Keep Block or this. I don't know that stuff, but I know the general reasons. So here are some examples. There's a transgender woman in protective custody at EMTC could not be brought down when any male-identified individuals were using the support center. Now at EMTC, the support center includes the video court, and it includes parole, and it includes the Office of Child Support Services, it includes CUCS benefits, and it includes me. So anyone using those 5 services would have to have left in order for her to come to see me. Not surprisingly, those services were all busy. I didn't see her for over 2 weeks. That meant that we had over 2 weeks delay in a housing application, so that when she came home a week later, that housing application was still pending, rather than her coming home directly to housing. There was a cisgender man at EMTC. He was in a gang-affiliated restrictive housing unit, and so he could not be in the support center until everyone else had been seen. Again, there were 5 different services in the support center. He never got called down to see me, and he ended up being discharged, and I never got offered any services. That also means he didn't access any of the other services down there. So if he had questions about his child support, if he had questions about benefits, he didn't get to answer any of those questions. On average, I see more people in some form of isolated or restricted custody at RMSC than at EMTC. And the majority of people I see in some form of restricted housing identify as transgender. And now this could be because I am known among transgender populations on Rikers, and so it could be that transgender people in some form of isolated confinement ask for me more than cisgender people do. I don't know. It could also be because transgender people are more often in isolated confinement than cisgender people are. And I just want to talk about the physicality of this for those of us who have not had to witness it on our own bodies. My clients come in with a chain around their waist, and their hands are shackled to that chain in the back. They then have their hands repositioned to the front where they are shackled again. Their hands are covered in what looks like large black foam cups. They completely cover the fingers and most of the wrist. The first time I ever saw a client like this, I actually thought it was a medical apparatus, because I met with so many people in solitary confinement in the upstate prisons who have never had their hands completely covered before. I couldn't figure out what it was. I thought my client was injured, but no, they were just having their entire hands covered. Every single time I have to ask them to sign a document or to read something, I have to ask the captain, who is staring and making eye contact with my client the entire time, to come in and undo the cups so that they can hold a document to read it, or so that they can sign a document. Anytime I give them legal documents, it goes into a folder, which I then hand to the captain, so they don't even hold their own legal documents. And yes, and again, like the captain makes direct eye contact with my client the entire time I am meeting. So anything that is of a sensitive nature would be very, very difficult to discuss. I really urge you to actually see these different types of restriction that people have to wear when they're leaving restrictive housing, because there is a very sort of innate reaction when you see it, where you think, no, this is wrong. We cannot do this to people. And I think when we're sort of sitting here and we don't have that visual, it's easy to forget how intense it is. And then I also just want to echo what everyone has been saying already about how intense the medical and mental health aspects of solitary are. So I'm meeting with someone to talk about something like a name change, and we have to sit for maybe 20 minutes and talk about like how I'm not going to hurt them for them to believe me that I will help them with a name change. Because the paranoia and sometimes the hallucinations and all the different things that come up when someone has been isolated can make it very, very hard for them to engage in any kind of reentry services. And there have not been very good studies on this, but there was a study recently in North Carolina, and they found that 1/4 of people who came home directly from solitary confinement to the streets committed suicide. So, I mean, there's not enough studies on this. It's very hard to say concretely these are the facts, but we know this already from all the stories today, and we know this already from people we love having gone through this, that it's, I'm really honored that I get to provide the services I provide, but my services are meaningless if the person I'm meeting with is so distraught and so upset that they cannot even remember my name 2 seconds after I've said it, which is often the case, that people can't remember who I am or what I did or what we talked about. So that's my testimony, and I will submit that in writing as well. And then I wanted to read a statement. My name is Venus. I'm a transgender woman currently in the city jails. What everyone on the Board of Corrections needs to know is that solitary breaks you down. No matter how big or small the cell, you can't walk out and you can't get fresh air. You can't walk away from a problem. They tell you to walk away from it, but you can't. You feel like an animal, like you're losing touch with yourself. It's bad enough you're already losing touch with your family, but then this is worse. You're losing touch with everything. They call them forget-me-not cells. They throw you in there and they forget you. Being transgender, once an officer put a dead rat on a plate of food. They would stand in front of the door and they would tell me that unless I started to touch myself, I wouldn't get toilet paper or food. Who would I tell about this? They control my letters, they monitor my visits. I have felt like nothing and I have felt forgotten. And this is the second one. This woman went to be anonymous, but she is also a transgender woman currently inside the city jails. I want you to know that trans women are treated differently even at RMSC. I invite the board, I am told you'll go to a men's jail all the time. You know they don't say that to the other women. We are handcuffed to the tables because they won't place us in with the cis women. We are denied razors in restrictive housing. Do you know what it feels like to have something happening to your body that is so deeply wrong? I'm already isolated and I'm already different, and then I'm made to have facial hair too. I would complain, but no one does rounds. I know this because I'm there. I invite the board to only shower once every 3 days. I invite the board to have taken away from them something of value to you that could not be valuable to another person, like a photograph or a letter. Thank you.
Thank you. Ruthie Lazenby, Ms. V, and Susanna Exglad.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Ruthie Lazenby. I'm a legal fellow with New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. New York Lawyers for the Public Interest is a civil rights organization that advocates for people with disabilities, for equal access to health care, and for environmental justice for low-income communities of color. I'm I'm also a person with a family member who was beaten and mistreated and deprived of necessary health care while incarcerated on Rikers Island after an arrest due to an episode of severe mental illness. We call on the New York City Board of Correction to end solitary confinement in all its forms and to adopt humane, effective, and safe alternatives. Solitary confinement is counterproductive to the aims of the justice system, always harmful to the people subjected to it, and often violates international law. In 2011, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture remarked that solitary confinement is contrary to one of the essential aims of the penitentiary system, which is to rehabilitate offenders and facilitate their reintegration into society. He urged the abolition of all punitive use of solitary confinement. Just this year, a new study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association confirmed his statements, finding that of hundreds of thousands of people released from prison over a 15-year period, people who had spent time in solitary confinement were significantly more likely to die, including by suicide, homicide, and overdose, and to be reincarcerated after release, with the risks increasing as the time in solitary increased. The impact of solitary confinement on psychological well-being has been well documented. Psychological effects of solitary confinement include anxiety, depression, anger, cognitive disturbances, perceptual distortions, obsessive thoughts, paranoia, and psychosis. The use of solitary can spark a vicious cycle in which an incarcerated person's mental health deteriorates and they engage in acts of desperation, resulting in further punitive measures. Solitary confinement is wrong, unequivocally, and should be ended. To the extent that New York City continues the practice of isolating people in solitary confinement at all, the proposed rule presents a number of major shortcomings. Critically, the rule provides for exceptions that would allow solitary confinement for torturous lengths of time in violation of international law, and fails to provide adequate due process for individuals in disciplinary hearings that could result in solitary confinement. First, not only does the proposed rule allow for solitary confinement, it does so for torturous lengths of time in violation of international law. In 2011, the then current UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, released a report concluding that the application of solitary confinement for more than 15 days in and of itself constitutes prolonged solitary confinement and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or even torture in violation of Article 7 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and Article 1 of the Convention Against Torture or Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Punishment, which the United States has notably both signed and ratified. The proposed rule is out of step with this imperative. The proposed rule allows people to be sentenced for 60 days in solitary confinement for alleged assaults on staff, 4 times the 15-day limitation under international law. Additionally, the proposed rule would still allow for unlimited time in solitary because it would create exceptions to both the requirement of 7 days out of solitary after serving 15 days and to the limit of 60 total days in solitary in a 6-month period. The international Mandela rules unequivocally prohibit indefinite solitary confinement. These loopholes must be closed to ensure that people are not tortured while in BOC custody. Second, the rule fails to provide adequate due process for people charged with violating the BOC's disciplinary rules. The potential harm associated with solitary confinement is enormous. Compared with individuals who had been incarcerated but were not placed in a restrictive setting, people who had spent time in restrictive settings were 78% more likely to die by suicide and 127% more likely to die of an opioid overdose in the first 2 weeks after their release. Despite these severe consequences, the BOC's proposed rule provides no mechanism for individuals to be represented by a lawyer or any other advocate at a disciplinary hearing. The rule's requirement that an individual's criminal defense attorney be notified when the individual is charged with an infraction that could result in solitary confinement is important, but far from sufficient given the severity of the potential consequences. The rule should be changed to mandate that individuals be represented during these crucial hearings. We look forward to continuing to work with the BOC to ensure that its rules are in line with international standards and that people with disabilities receive the care they need and the due process justice requires.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Ms. V. I'm community health and justice organizer at the Mental Health Project Urban Justice Center. I'm also a member of the Jails Action Coalition, and I've been a member since working on Rikers, and I joined back in 2012. I've testified before this board for the last 8 years, begging many of you, all of you, different faces of you in different times and seasons to do the right thing. I wasn't actually going to testify today, but I always feel compelled when I hear individuals who speak their own truth. And one of the main reasons I came forward years ago is because so often people in position to make change in power do not often actually believe individuals and their direct truth. And so as being a civilian worker doing cognitive behavioral therapy on Rikers and in DOC facilities, I felt it was very important to stand with those formerly incarcerated when they come before you and tell you their truth. I think that it is important right now, when you start thinking about these rules and these minimums, to really dig into the monitor's report. This is the 8th report. If change was going to happen, change would have started to occur. The 8th report, to me, is like one of the worst reports. And it's left up to you, the independent oversight, to actually initiate change. So we cannot talk anymore about what we want to see. We have to make it happen. See, one of the reasons Akeem Browder, Khalif Browder's brother, actually respects me is because I worked on the island with his brother. And I told him, when we was back in the day talking about shut down Rikers, I told him, you know, I'm in it for the long haul. I'm not going nowhere. I will help get your brother's truth out. And I did not disappear. In 2015, I had emergency brain surgery. The very next week, I could barely get my name out, and I had my neuro ICU nurse call into the advisory board because I wanted DOC to know I wasn't going anywhere. And I say that often to you because I want you to know how dedicated I am in this fight. At the last meeting, I gave you a whole list of stats and facts for you to go follow up on, so I'm not going to do that this time. Rewind the tape if you missed it. But what I do want to tell you is that everything you heard today is true. Vidal spoke about programming. For years, I was one of the people at City Council fighting for DOC to get an extension and funds to put these programs in place. Now they have the programs, but individuals aren't being brought to them. They make excuses all the way around the board. When we talk about solitary confinement, we can't talk about putting anyone in any type of punishment without actually holding DOC accountable. The federal monitor has clearly told you DOC should not in any way be responsible for young adults. Now, DC Tulsic has been terminated by DOC, and now he was running the advisory board. Now he was replaced. The person that's replacing him is slowly dismantling the advisory board. Anything that the commissioner has came up here to talk about that occurred over the last 5 years has occurred while that board was in place. You cannot talk about moving forward without dealing with directly impacted people, without speaking to experts on how to move forward. So why is that board being dismantled? Why is it not being brought to any of you that is being dismantled? Why is an entire department, ACS got the one, I don't know your name, what's your name? Franco? I'm sorry. I think that you should now really have the board focus on why is the young adults now being blended into just adults. DOC still has access to horizons. DOC still has individuals that qualify for being between the ages of 16 to 21. There is no reason at all that any type of punishment should be voted forward with anything without the advisory board being spoken to, without experts being brought in, because that's a different population. Their brains are still not properly developed, and it's just another example of how DOC will sweep things under the rug, do sneaky things behind your back, and don't have to answer to you because they do not respect you. Please do your job this year. 2020, I want y'all all to have 2020 vision, and I want y'all all to understand. They told me years ago when I said we was going to close down Rikers, oh, Ms. V, you crazy, that'll never happen. And guess what happened in 2019? Guess what happened? They voted to close down Rikers. In 2013, I said we trying to end solitary confinement for 16, 21-year-olds. In 2014, guess what happened? The city council passed that bill. In 2015, y'all allowed them to open up ESH and act like we didn't pass that bill to end solitary confinement for 16, 21-year-olds. Now I'm asking you on the record, please do your job. I'm not threatening you. I'm just basing because one of your members last meeting said I come off cross like a threat. I'm not coming off like a threat. I'm coming off as an American citizen who is standing here speaking for those unseen and unheard who do not have the voice or the ability to come before you today and let you know lives are on the line. Stop playing with people's lives. We have to do our jobs. We all have a position. I organize. We get people here to speak their truth. It's up to you to listen to that. And if you need help organizing on how to make it happen, call me up. I'm just an email away. I show up for the city. I do it for my people. Now do your job for the people as well. Have a blessed day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Susanna Ekblad, and I'm a social work supervisor in the criminal defense practice at Brooklyn Defender Services. I've been a criminal defense social worker for over 10 years, advocating on behalf of clients incarcerated at Rikers Island. In my current position, I visit my clients regularly at Rikers every month, both to gather information to help advocate on their cases, but also to discuss their experiences of daily life in jail. I'll focus my comments today on the department's lack of transparency and communication during disciplinary hearings and housing placements to people incarcerated in our city jails. Common issues I hear from people I visit include the lack of information and documentation provided by the department and the lack of willingness or urgency by the department to provide information upon request. When people are written up for infractions, the department is supposed to provide a written notice of the upcoming hearing. Far too often, people report to our office that they didn't know they received a ticket, or they didn't know about a disciplinary hearing, or that a decision was made. In these situations, when our office advocates on our client's behalf, DOC claims the person refused, but the proof we are provided is typically a copy of the notice showing an officer's note that the person refused, rather than the signature of our client. The board's proposal requiring the department to video record these interactions is a step in the right direction, but we urge the board to go further. 1, if the person in custody is out of the facility for court, a medical appointment, or on a legal or other professional visit when called for their disciplinary hearing, the department must reschedule the hearing rather than proceed in absentia. 2, defense attorneys should immediately be notified when a person is given an infraction. 3, all people in custody must be provided easy access to department policies and procedures along with the Board of Corrections minimum standards. Both should be provided and easily accessible in housing units and law libraries and upon request by a person in custody. We hear regularly that people do not have access to DOC's policies and procedures, and many do not even know that the department maintains written directives or that the board exists or mandates minimum standards. Ensuring that people have a clear sense of the expectations, their rights, and what steps they can take will diffuse tension, decrease violence, and make our jails safer. A recent example illustrates the importance of clear expectations and communication. Our office represented a man held in a restrictive unit who was unsure why he was placed there or when he'd be allowed to return to general population. As anyone would, he asked a steady officer, who was unfortunately unable to answer our client's questions. This tension grew and resulted in aggressive behavior by both our client and department staff, which eventually led to additional time in restrictive housing. Our client was understandably frustrated, as was the department staff, who were unable to answer questions or give clear information and expectations for his placement in restrictive housing. All of this could have been avoided had staff clearly communicated with our client. This is not a unique example, but rather a situation that happens regularly and one that the department repeatedly fails to address. The department already has prepared materials on the rules of the jails, namely the DOC handbook and the DOC rulebook. Although these materials are supposed to be provided to people at intake, along with their Bill of Rights and the Connections Reentry Guide published by New York Public Library, that is rarely the case. Almost all of my clients report that they were never provided with such materials. Equally troubling, while many of the rules and standards have changed, some of these materials haven't been updated since 2007. The board should require the department to regularly update the rulebook and handbook and to incorporate information about the board's purpose and how people can educate themselves about the board and access current minimum standards and policies. As we all know, the potential repercussions of being placed in solitary confinement are very serious. experiences in solitary can result in long-lasting or permanent psychological damage, and as we have seen tragically and repeatedly here on Rikers Island, even death. We are extremely troubled by the fact that people are systematically denied information on rules, rights, services, and re-entry that would help them navigate and even avoid solitary confinement. This secrecy and lack of transparency disempowers people. It's critical that the board and DOC adopt a transparent system that embodies clear communication and expectations. This board has an opportunity to truly transform the way we treat people in custody, provide them with information, and in return, reduce the violence that stems from the lack of transparency that currently exists for people inside our jails. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Kayla Simpson, Olga Delgado, and Isabel Jackson. Good morning.
Good morning. My name's Kayla Simpson. Welcome, Mr. Franco. Nice to see you on the board. I am a staff attorney at the Prisoners' Rights Project of the Legal Aid Society. I'm also co-counsel for the plaintiff class on Nunez. And nothing I could say is more powerful than the words of the people who have come here, who have survived isolation, and literally had the courage to show us all the pain in their voices and reopen wounds so that we can understand what it's like to be in isolation. And I'm humbled by you, so thank you so much. And I think, and I hope that applause is for you and not for me. I think that to walk this path, we sort of need to understand the landscape. And I don't think that there is a better survey of the landscape than the most recent Nunez Monitors report that so many people have invoked today. And I think it's right to invoke it. I talked to you last time I was here about the horrible use of force numbers, the high levels of violence, the insubordination, the findings of dehumanization and toxic culture that the monitoring team laid forth in really compelling language. And again, I urge you to read it. I know it's long. But I think important to highlight again is the findings that the monitoring team makes about the department's inability to implement systems with fidelity, its inability to use its discretion in a way that complies with the court's order. And you see that in the areas of noncompliance: investigation, discipline, the inability to treat the young adult population in a way that is compliant with the court order, and the skyrocketing use of force numbers. And the other common refrain that you see is how often the monitoring team has to say, only after significant pressure from the monitoring team did this basic thing happen, right? And I think that current history of operational failure, and it couldn't be more clear, is the thing that you must consider as you think about what the language of these proposed rules should say. Because a lot of it, and I said this last time, invokes the department to utilize meaningful discretion in how it treats people, how it isolates people, how it restricts people, and when it removes them from those deprivations. And they've demonstrated to you that they cannot exercise that discretion. It's the same department that the monitor says cannot recognize at all levels when a use of force is excessive, when it is problematic, when it's unconstitutional, right? And those are the people who are asking you to allow them to do 7-day waivers, to allow them to keep people in separation status, to create dangerously amorphous housing categories like solo housing, which is nowhere in the rules, like de-escalation housing, which is a slippery slope, and it has mountains of catch-all security exceptions that permit that same abuse of discretion to flourish. And it all comes back to the touchstone, I think, of safety. And everyone here has said, isolation isn't safety. And I think Jumaane Williams made an important point about how we can separate people without isolating them. I think that's critical, and we should talk about where the rubber meets the road on what a rule should look like that says that. But the board staff rightfully noted in its first report on ESH that human beings, as a general rule, not just in a correctional context, are more likely to respond well to discipline, to respond well to systems in general, when they perceive that the process that got them to that point is fair. And I think that's why the due process section is particularly important in the rules. And I just think the fundamental thing is this: the departments, and even some of the premise of the substance of the rules, the department's default response is deprivation. When there is a problem, deprivation is the default. But what if we rejected that premise? What if we listened to Vidal Guzman when he talks about the alternative to violence programs? What if, when we looked at the words of the rules, the subchapters, the standards, that we saw the face of Harvey, and we saw the face of Layleen Polanco? Because, and I think I said this before, reform happens here. Reform happens in these subchapters. Reform happens when we think about what medical care is adequate for people in isolation, when we think about Layleen. When we talk about how much discretion to give the department, hear Harvey's words: don't feed cell 22. Those are the things that the standards must capture. Those are the things that they must address. And I think that's why not only the words themselves matter, but why the reporting requirements matter, because that's what enables you going forward to be able to ensure that the department, who isn't here today, implements those systems with fidelity, gives you the data you need to hold them accountable, and frankly, the data we all need to hold them accountable. And so as we consider them, I hope that we all see the faces of the survivors, of the faces of the people behind those walls, so that we can ensure that the very noble and laudable goals that you articulated in the statement of basis and purpose are reflected in the letter of those standards. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Olga Delgado. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Olga Delgado, and I am with Justice Leadership USA, and I am here on behalf of my son, Ricardo Delgado. He's incarcerated, and he's in the box right now for 9 months. He was 2.5 years in Rikers, and while he was there, he was 1.5 years in the box, solitary confinement. They took him out every day with handcuffs and chained to his waist down to his feet, to be attached to the table all day long. If he moves, we'll cut his wrists and his feet, ankles. His back was hurting also. On Mother's Day, they couldn't hug or kiss him. They are humans. And also another time, he was walking in the hall with 2 officers, one in front, one in the back. 2 others officers were walking towards them with a German Shepherd dog. And the dog jumped on top of my son. He put his handcuffs to his stomach so the top teeth of the dog didn't go through his clothes. But the bottom teeth did scratch him, and the officers were laughing. And my son was very scared and asked to visit a nurse because of the bite. This happened at 5:30. Didn't see the nurse until 11 p.m. and were making jokes about him. This is a big, progressive city, and the government needs to stop solitary confinement so it doesn't happen what happens to Khalif Browdy. That ended up killing himself. It was wrong 800 days in the box. They are humans. For this reason, I want the board to implement the blueprint to end solitary confinement that advocates develop it. Also, showers are 8 minutes and very little water. It is very difficult to rush when there is not enough water to go out in the yard. When it's winter, very cold, they are not allowed to wear thermos under their uniform, which is very thin, or when it's very hot and it's extremely 90, 100 degrees, very hot, no air conditioner, and that's why that reason I'm here to ask the blueprint to end solitary confinement. Thank you very much.
Chair.
Thank you. Dr. Cohn?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Ms. Delgado. And I'm not asking a question, but I just feel this is very important for the board to hear this. You know, we sit here all the time, and there are comments in the morning, the first thing before the thing, and we listen. We never talk together because we have no capacity as a group to talk except in 4 people. And that only happens on the phone pretty much or on a very specific subject. So I really hope that as we go forward with this project that we will have a meeting of the board where you listen to us if you want to come, but where we will talk together, like the City Council talked together when they debated the closing of Rikers Island, that the board can meet together, not in, you know, with City Hall overlooking everybody who didn't come in any significant number today, not with the commission being present in the meeting, I mean the department, although they had no interest in coming today, not with dogs present, the way your son had to put up with it, and with the recognition of the, I'm sorry to give a speech on this, but the recognition of the Nunez report, where the department could not give enough of any consideration to the horror that report described, and then sent it, you know, and sent the response to a junior assistant attorney in the department rather than speaking directly. We're going to talk about that again, but this is. We have a lot of work to do. A lot of things that you're asking for should be in the rule. I hope they end up back in the rule, and some of it we didn't think about, and some of it some of it just disappeared somehow. So I just want to thank you for being here and how important it is. We have a few more people, I'm sure, to speak, and the presence on next week when will be important as well when we meet again next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohn.
I appreciate, I think it's important, since we are creating a public record, to make it clear that there's a lot of work that has been done here. There are a lot of points that have been made today that resonate with many of us on the board and will be taken into serious consideration. We appreciate all the testimony that has been presented. It is important to note that this rule, the draft rule, was not created without any conversation among board members. There has been extensive conversation. There's been a lot of back and forth. I am not at all suggesting that it is the most definitive and complete and best rule. I am not suggesting that at all. It is a beginning. It is a working document. What you've done today has given us significant, pause for consideration and for much more work to be done. But I do think it's important for the record for it to be noted that there has been extensive conversation among board members.
Thank you. Good morning.
What? No. Oh.
My name is Isabel Jackson, and I'm sharing testimony today on behalf of Councilmember Carlina Rivera. Thank you, members of the board, for accepting my testimony this morning. As the co-chair of the New York City Council's Women's Caucus and a member of the Council's Progressive Caucus, I continue to urge the city to end solitary confinement in all its forms. The Board of Corrections' proposed rule changes, which still allow solitary confinement for up to 15 days, merely reduce the torturous practice rather than fully eliminate it. On June 26, 2019, the Progressive and Women's Caucuses of New York City Council sent a letter to the Department of Correction, the Board of Correction, and the mayor demanding an immediate end to solitary. Our call to end solitary came in response to the death of a 27-year-old trans woman of color at Rikers. Layleen Polanco spent the last 9 days of her life in solitary confinement until she was discovered unconscious in her cell on June 7th. I have since joined the Halt Solitary campaign in supporting their blueprint to end solitary in New York City, which the board should be considering instead of the plan before you. These proposed changes come after months of delays and the mayor's unprecedented decision to not reappoint Commissioner Breanne Hamill, who had worked for years on a comprehensive proposal to restrict solitary confinement. With such high stakes, the lack of transparency offered by the mayor's office regarding this decision and these rules is concerning. The proposed rule changes also inaccurately attempt to draw a balance between, quote, rehabilitation and, quote, order, by including the provision of up to 60 days of sentencing in solitary confinement for alleged assaults on staff. However, multiple studies, including a 2015 examination from the University of Texas at Dallas, found that those who were disciplined with time in solitary were no more or less violent after the punishment. Moreover, the rule changes were publicly released just 1 day after a report by the federal monitor charged with overseeing the city jail system found that, quote, staff are often hyper-confrontational and respond to incidents in a manner that is hasty, hurried, thoughtless, reckless, careless, or in disregard, end quote. It is unacceptable that still, in 2019, New York City jails continue to employ this inhumane practice. In consideration of the City Council's recent vote to close Rikers Island, it's imperative that New York City embrace evidence-based incarceration policies that are smart and progressive moving forward. New York City should continue to be a leader in reforming the criminal justice system and ensuring the humanity and dignity of every person. I strongly urge the Board of Correction to adopt safe alternatives to solitary confinement. Until then, my office will continue to advocate for an end to this harmful practice. Thank you.
Thank you. The next three speakers are Marco Barrios, Joanna Weiss, and Grace Price.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Marco Barrios, a member and leader of Justice Leadership USA. As a former incarcerated individual, throughout my 24 years and 6 months, I am fortunate to say that I never endured the horror and trauma of solitary confinement. The ability of staying away from this inhumane practice by the Department of Corrections had to do with a combination of luck, avoiding self-destructive activities, and utilizing my time for growth and healing with the help of God. Members of the board, what I want to share with you is simply my lived experiences in correctional facilities and in witnessing individuals going to solitary confinement and its effects. During my incarceration, many of the individuals I witnessed going to the box had either mental health issues, drug addiction, or both. Some did have behavioral health issues. However, what I find hard to believe is the inconceivable notion that the usage of solitary confinement kept people safe, deters individuals from committing misbehaviors, or in any way addresses the issues that cause their behavior. Often what I witnessed when there were physical altercations, the individuals that went to the box and came out were much more bitter and mentally unstable, at times even more violent. This certainly did not make me feel more safer, and I wonder if the correctional staff felt the same. The fact that certain individuals kept going to the box convinced me that there was that this was the wrong way of going about making people in the facility safer, correcting someone's behavior, and certainly treating individuals as human beings. As you're aware, there are numerous articles and reports about solitary confinement. All of them, well, the ones I read, shared the damaging effects of spending time in solitary confinement. And just as important, there are blueprints on alternatives to such practices, including the blueprint to end solitary confinement that the Jails Action Coalition developed. Now, I know it's difficult to make changes in a system that has been in place for such a long time. But it is time to get rid of the type of punishment that is cruel, inhumane, and counterproductive. And make no mistake, even if the board considers shortening the length of time a person has to do in solitary confinement, it only keeps in place an ineffective jail-based punishment, instead of going in a different direction, as many states has done. Now, this is an important historical moment, such as we have seen by New York City's commitment to close Rikers Island, shrink the jail system to 4 borough-based facilities, and build communities. And as a proud member of the Program and Subcommittee to the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice Task Force, I do see promising reform and cultural change in the jail system. Finally, my testimony today is not based on any academic credentials, but on the solely on evidence of my lived experience in a jail and prison setting. I want to just share with you a situation I went through years ago. There was a guy next to me, next to my cell, and he was self-mutilating himself. Thankfully, there was a sergeant that decided to treat him as a human being by not calling in a special unit. Usually they go in and do whatever they have to do to take you out. He was threatening the officers, but eventually he was giving up because the more he waited, the more the individual was self-mutilating himself. So I looked at him and I told him, can I go and speak to him? The individual didn't speak English, so I was able to speak to him in Spanish. Eventually, I was able to convince him to relinquish his weapon and give it to the officer. He also told me, the officer told me to tell him, well, he's not going to go to the box. We're going to send him to MSU. We're going to take him to the hospital, treat him, send him to MSU, put him in a room, and eventually he'll get mental health treatment. And that's what they did. But that was the only time I ever seen something like that. So your question to how we can work by alternatives to solitary confinement, that's one of the ways we can do it, by de-escalation, treatment, rehabilitative treatment, and avoid people going to solitary confinement. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Joanna Weiss. Ms. Price. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I will actually turn in my testimony today. I know I threatened the last time I spoke, and I will include that testimony from early October in my 16-page tome that I'll turn in today. I'm Kelly Grace Price, the founder of the Closed Rosies Advocacy Group, and I'd like to speak about 3 main points this morning. They're a bit administrative, and one of them, Ms. Oversee, I'm going to especially apologize to you about. You'll understand. I'd like to talk about data in solitary confinement. As you know, I've spent no small amount of enormous time digging into the data that I wrestled away from the DOC via FOIL to learn so that we could have some kind of baseline to understand what was going on Rosies, because nobody, not even MockJ, had bothered to publish any kind of data about what was going on. And one of the things that I found is that over the last 5 years, the majority of people on Rosie's that were going into punitive seg-like conditions were white women, which doesn't make any sense, or maybe it does make sense, but I just thought I'd throw that out there. It seems odd because that's the smallest population of people, one of the smallest population of people on Rosie's. And also youth. There's an egregious amount of youth going in still into punitive seg. And those stats are at the beginning of my testimony with really nice graphics actually. And I also wanted to talk about some lessons learned from the last couple of rulemaking processes that I have witnessed. Of course, the first being ESH back in 2014, 2015, and the second being PREA back in 2016 and ongoing. I mentioned during my last testimony that there are egregious problems with the data being unhanded on blended units, and of course that data was a promise of the ESH implementation. Remember that these reports are not being honored and the data being handed over that is part of the rulemaking process is corrupt. And we really need rigorous people and consistency in the board staff for adequate oversight. Regarding PREA, PREA is a litmus test for all changes. There was an article in the Daily News yesterday where the department tried to pass off to an ingenue Daily News reporter that they'd solved all PREA issues. The reporter didn't even know that the mock audit that the department was trying to get her to swallow was an audit of the federal standards. She didn't even understand that there were local standards. And luckily I was able to intercede and get a little pull quote in that article, but instead of actually doing the PREA work and following the standards of implementation, all of their effort is going into this smokescreen and this pretend PR campaign where Serena gets up with her hair and makeup done in front of the cameras and pretends that she saved the day and implemented PREA. Now, we have to be very careful because that's a rule that the community came together to work on that is still unimplemented, but instead of putting effort into actual implementation, the department is putting effort into PR bluster. The fourth thing I want to talk about is that I filed a lawsuit against the Board of Correction this morning because it appears that the Board of Correction appointments are not being made as to the city charter standards. If you read the city charter, the BOC's charter, it says that appointments should be made on a rotating basis as vacancies occur. But as you know, the mayor has been disingenuously plucking members that I assume he feels will not vote according to the way that he wants, witness Honorable Breon Hamill being removed, and then replacing them. But he has no right to automatically replace the vacancies. The vacancy has to be reappointed by the rotating appointment authority. In this case, I believe the city council should have had the pick as to who was going to get the vacancy. And the mayor, I'm sorry, Mr. Franco, but the mayor, I believe, or it was Mr. Hernandez that was, I get confused. But regardless, the city council has only had 3 appointment opportunities in the last 6 years, when there have been 14 board appointments. Now, the city council should have at least had 4 of those appointments, maybe 5 of those appointments. And the overall effect of this is that we don't have an efficacious board. I'm sorry, Ms. Ovesi, I filed a demand for declaratory and injunctive relief. I'm just waiting for my index number, and you'll be served that, I expect, within the next couple of days. We're going to ask for no further votes from this board until this issue comes to its fruition. Thank you, as always.
Thank you. We're going to move to the next 2 speakers, Candy and Darlene Jackson.
Hello, my name is Candy. I use the alias Solitary Survivor because being a solitary is nothing but survival of the fittest. And when I was in solitary confinement, it was absolute torture. I had a little speech, but listening to people's testimony, I'm just going to be a little bit off track right now because Mr. Kim said earlier about a constituent that he had who had mitts on and waist chain, shackles, and I concurred so many infractions for AOS, assaulting staff, and destroying property. But just as he said, that the person couldn't even sign a piece of paper. So how could I break a chair if I can't even sign a piece of paper? Or how can I swing at an officer if I'm shackled and cuffed? Those black mitts are for people that use weapons. I never had a weapon. I was always inside of a cell for 24 hours a day. And if I did have a weapon, I would try to commit suicide by cutting myself, hanging myself in my cell, swallowing detergent, swallowing pills. They don't watch you take your psych medication like they say they do. You can just throw it on the floor and save them. So I've swallowed pills. I've done it all. And I try not to mix religion with politics, but too bad. Bless you.
Thank you.
Today I'm going to have to do that because that's why I'm here today. I used to wonder why I was put in solitary. I don't commit crimes. I'm not a bad person. I don't go around fighting. I had a master's degree before I was incarcerated, and I was still in college. I missed my graduation. I missed it all. But the reason why I was put there was because God put me there so I could see exactly what goes on. People ask me about prison. People ask me about jail. I can't tell you about prison. I can't tell you about jail. But I can tell you everything about solitary from that one little window that I was able to look out 24 hours a day. And yes, 24. It's not 23, it's 24, because if the officer does not want you to go to rec, you're not going to go to recreation. If you are female and you're asking for sanitary napkins, guess what? You won't get any sanitary napkins. You better try to stop the bleeding the best way you can. And don't use a DOC jumper because you will get an infraction for destroying DOC property. I apologize if I sound like a broken record, but it seems like I thought by now God would bless this earth and they were in solitary confinement. And my husband committed suicide as a result of this because it doesn't just affect the inmate, it affects the family too. My husband wanted to get back together and get intimate, but every time I try to get intimate, all I see is Captain Morgan on top of me, Officer Terry touching me. I was sexually abused in there. I was dehumanized. I'll never be the same. I might look normal to the average person, but I'm not. I have nightmares every single day. I have to go to the restroom every 2 minutes because I can't hold my urine, because if you're cuffed like this for 14 hours, 16 hours, you can't use the restroom. You have to hold it. So I destroyed my bladder. I'm begging you to please end solitary confinement. My days on this earth are not numbered. I'm going to be another Khalif Browder one day. I'm just asking you from my heart to your heart to God's ears to please end solitary confinement as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your words.
I'm sorry, I have to take a minute. So my name is Darlene. I'm so sorry. My name is Darlene Jackson. I'm a project coordinator at the Women's Community Justice Association that's leading the Beyond Rosie's 2020 campaign, an effort to close the Rose M. Singer Center on Rikers Island by 2020 and replacing it with a standalone centralized facility in Manhattan for less than 100 women that includes the LGBTQ community. I'm here today with our coalition partners, many in the room this morning, to support the blueprint to end solitary confinement in New York City jails. The Beyond Rosie's 2020 campaign advocates for the removal of the Department of Corrections to be the main operators of any city jail, as data have shown that law enforcement is not the appropriate city agency trained in trauma-informed care, gender-responsive services, therapeutic crisis intervention, and or de-escalation. We support the Department of Mental Health and Mental Hygiene being the primary caretakers of New York City jails, with DOC merely providing safety and security. But DOC currently operates our city jails. This board has the responsibility to provide oversight and accountability and ensure the safety for everyone. In addition, the Beyond Rosie's campaign advocates the removal of all people suffering from serious mental illness and pregnant women out of city jails and into specialized ATI programs. As the city is approaching the implementation process to replace Rikers Island with borough-based facilities that entails programming and design, this board has the opportunity now to shift from a torture, punitive system that only serves to destroy human beings to a model that is solely based on restorative justice and rehabilitation to restore humanity and reimagine justice, dignity, and safety. Anything other than what's outlined in the blueprint to end solitary confinement in the New York City jails is an atrocity. The culture of violence ends by the political will of this board. I've witnessed this board listen to more than a dozen of testimonies from survivors of solitary confinement, the impact on families and their communities, and service providers that work in barbaric conditions, all calling for an end of solitary confinement. The time is now to do what is right and not what is easy. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the testimony for today, and we will close the hearing for today. Before doing so, I did want to say we deeply echo the words of several of my fellow board members that we really appreciate your presence today, the courage it has taken to share your experiences, and your determination to be a part of this rulemaking process. We have heard you, and will carefully consider your words as we move forward with the rulemaking process. Wherever possible, please do submit written statements. They will be distributed to board members. We will read them, we will review them, we will consider them. And we will return for another hearing starting at 5:30 p.m. in this room on December 16th. Thank you very much again for being here today.